The church doors opened at the exact moment the groom said, "I do," and time inside St. Patrick's old cathedral froze. 400 powerful men turned at once, instinct before thought, fear before reason. The organ died mid-note. Walking down the center aisle alone was Bumpy Johnson, calm, uninvited, carrying a silver-wrapped gift. In an all-white Italian mob wedding, his presence wasn't just shocking, it was a violation. Carlo Gambino stood. His nephew's hand slid toward a gun. Soldiers across the pews shifted, calculating angles, exits, consequences. No one spoke, no one breathed. Bumpy didn't slow. He walked straight to Gambino, stopped 3 feet away, and held out the gift. "Open it," he said. Not privately, not later. Now, in front of everyone. 6 hours earlier, that same gift sat open on Bumpy's desk in Harlem. Inside wasn't celebration. Inside was truth, financial records, commission meeting minutes, proof of betrayal. 3 months of paid informants, cross-checked lies and quiet patience. Information powerful enough to end a war without firing a single shot, if revealed at the right moment in front of the right witnesses. Harlem had been under siege for a year. Not openly, quietly, collectors first, then threats, then blood. Willie Carter refused to pay tribute and died slowly in a hospital bed. His widow didn't ask Bumpy for revenge. She asked how Harlem was supposed to survive. That question mattered more than anger ever could. Violence would have meant war. Silence would have meant surrender. So Bumpy investigated upward, not outward. He didn't follow soldiers. He followed money. What he found was fatal. Carlo Gambino had lied to the commission for 8 months while secretly running Harlem operations worth millions. In the Mafia, betrayal like that was a death sentence. Back in the cathedral, Gambino opened the box. The envelope inside was sealed with wax. When he read the first page, the color left his face. Other bosses leaned forward. They knew that look. Bonanno spoke from behind him. "Carlo, what is that?" Gambino said nothing. Bumpy turned to the room and explained everything calmly. Unauthorized Harlem operations, millions hidden, lies told directly to the commission, copies stored everywhere. If anything happened to him, everything went public. Violence wouldn't silence the truth, it would amplify it. Then Bumpy made his offer. Gambino would pull every man out of Harlem within 24 hours, every business, every operation. In return, the documents stayed private. Gambino lived. If not, the truth belonged to the world. The commission didn't argue. They examined the evidence themselves. The ruling came fast. Gambino would survive, but Harlem was permanently off limits to every Italian family. The decision wasn't emotional, it was structural. Bumpy nodded once. He congratulated the bride and groom. Then he turned and walked back down the aisle alone. No one stopped him. Fear and respect held everyone still. By midnight, Harlem was clear. Collectors vanished. Operations collapsed. No bullets fired, no blood spilled. Yet power in New York had shifted forever. Years later, when Carlo Gambino ruled everything else, Harlem remained untouched. When asked why, he gave the same answer every time. That man knows things. Bumpy Johnson died quietly in 1968. Gambino sent flowers. The lesson survived. Violence attracts attention. Intelligence controls outcomes. And the smartest man in the room doesn't raise his voice. He chooses his moment. The cathedral never truly returned to normal after that day. Even when the ceremony resumed, the words sounded hollow, like echoes of something already broken. People sat through the vows, but no one was listening. Every man there was replaying the same moment in his head. The walk, the box, the documents, the silence. Weddings were supposed to create alliances. This one had rewritten boundaries. Outside, Bumpy Johnson didn't rush. He walked through Little Italy at the same calm pace, gift box gone, hands free, mind clear. He knew the next few hours mattered more than the last few months. Truth had been released, but now it had to settle. Power never shifts instantly. It resists, it tests, it looks for cracks. Back in Harlem, word arrived before Bumpy did. Collectors stopped showing up. Threats disappeared overnight. Men who had been loud the week before suddenly became polite, distant, careful. By evening, businesses that had been pressured reopened without fear. Nobody announced anything. They didn't need to. Silence was confirmation. 3 days later, the commission met behind closed doors. No speeches, no theatrics, just consequences, fines, lost influence, quiet demotions. Carlo Gambino kept his life, but he lost something more dangerous to lose: momentum. In that world, momentum decided who rose and who stalled. Bumpy understood that better than anyone. He didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't claim victory. He returned to routine, knowing stability was the real win. Harlem didn't need parades. It needed space to breathe. And for the first time in a long time, it had it. Years passed. New faces rose. Old ones fell. But one rule remained untouched. Harlem stayed Harlem, not because of threats, not because of guns, because everyone remembered what happened when someone tried to take it quietly and got exposed loudly. Young men would ask how Bumpy survived so long. He always gave the same answer: pay attention, don't rush, and never waste the truth when timing can turn it into armor. The story kept spreading, not as gossip but as warning. You could fight power, or you could outthink it. Only one of those paths let you walk away. And somewhere deep in the city, long after the cathedral doors closed, that lesson kept working, quietly, patiently, exactly as Bumpy intended. Years later, when people spoke about that day, they rarely talked about the documents themselves. They talked about the silence, the kind of silence that falls when everyone in a room realizes the rules have changed and no one is sure who is safe anymore. That silence followed Carlo Gambino for the rest of his life. Inside his own family, trust shifted. Men watched their words more carefully around him. Ambition slowed. Nobody said it openly. Everyone understood that Gambino had been exposed once, and exposure is a weakness that never fully heals. Power survives on perception, and that perception had cracked in front of too many witnesses. In Harlem, the change was felt differently. There was no celebration, no speeches, no claims of victory. Bumpy Johnson never announced what he had done. He didn't need to. The absence of Italian collectors said everything. The absence of pressure said more. Harlem's independence had been secured not by violence but by precedent. That precedent mattered. Organized crime runs on memory. Every boss remembers what happened to the last man who crossed a line. After the wedding, Harlem became one of those lines. Not marked on maps, not written down, just understood. Bumpy returned to his routines, meetings, quiet conversations, conflict resolution without noise. He knew attention was dangerous. The more invisible his victory remained, the longer it would last. That restraint confused law enforcement and unsettled rivals. Chaos was easy to track, stability was not. Carlo Gambino eventually became boss of bosses. His reach extended into unions, courts, and politics. Yet even at the height of his power, Harlem remained untouched. When younger capos suggested expanding north, Gambino shut it down immediately, not angrily, not emotionally, just firmly. Harlem was off limits. When pressed for reasons, he never explained fully. He didn't need to. Saying Bumpy Johnson was enough. That name carried weight because it represented something rarer than violence. Certainty. The certainty that secrets could surface at the worst possible moment. Bumpy aged, but his mind stayed sharp. He understood that survival wasn't about dominance. It was about leverage, knowing when to speak, knowing when to wait. Knowing that truth, if timed correctly, could do what bullets never could: end a conflict permanently. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the Underworld noticed. Flowers arrived from unexpected places. One card stood out: simple, respectful. From Carlo Gambino himself. It wasn't an apology, it was acknowledgement. The story didn't die with Bumpy, it settled into legend. Told in barbershops, back rooms, and whispered conversations. The details changed slightly over time, but the core never did. A man walked into a mob wedding, exposed betrayal in front of everyone who mattered, and walked out alive. That's why the story endures. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean. No blood, no chaos, just intelligence applied at the exact right moment. And in a world built on force, that kind of victory is the most dangerous kind of all. The days that followed confirmed what everyone already understood. No announcements were made, no messages sent, no warnings issued. Yet Gambino's men vanished from Harlem as if they had never existed. Protection demands stopped overnight. Numbers banks operated without interference. Dealers who had been pressured suddenly found themselves left alone. The absence itself was the message. Other families noticed immediately. In this world, silence is louder than gunfire. When territory suddenly becomes untouched, people ask why. And the answer spread faster than any official order ever could. Harlem wasn't protected by muscle anymore. It was protected by memory. Law enforcement sensed the shift but couldn't explain it. No arrests, no shootings, no visible power struggle. Informants had nothing useful to offer. The streets were calmer than before, which made the situation even more confusing. Calm didn't fit their models. Calm meant someone smart was in control. Inside the underworld, conversations changed tone. Expansion plans were reconsidered. Ambitions slowed. Bosses reminded their men that some lines, once crossed, never get erased. Harlem became one of those lines, not because it was dangerous, but because touching it meant inviting exposure. Bumpy Johnson never claimed credit. He didn't tell the story himself. He didn't need to. People who mattered already knew. The rest would learn eventually. He understood that the less he said, the stronger the outcome became. Truth didn't need repetition. It only needed witnesses. Years passed. New names rose, old names fell. But whenever conflicts were discussed, someone eventually mentioned the wedding. The story functioned like a warning label. This is what happens when you underestimate a man who pays attention. When younger operators asked how Bumpy survived so long, the answer was always the same. He didn't confuse anger with action. He didn't mistake silence for weakness, and he never revealed everything, only enough. By the time Bumpy Johnson's life ended, Harlem's independence felt permanent. Not written into any rule book, but embedded into behavior. That kind of power doesn't fade quickly. The wedding had lasted an hour. The silence afterward lasted decades. Decades later, long after most of the men in that cathedral were gone, the consequences of that single moment were still visible. Harlem never became Italian territory, not in secret, not quietly, not temporarily. It stayed independent because the cost of challenging it had been made unmistakably clear. New bosses rose with fresh ideas and old ambitions. Each generation believed it might be smarter than the last. But every time Harlem came up in conversation, someone older would shut it down with a look. They didn't argue, they didn't explain, they just remembered. And memory, in that world, was law. What made the story endure wasn't the audacity of walking into the wedding. It was the restraint that followed. Bumpy didn't exploit the victory. He didn't expand. He didn't provoke. He held the line and let everyone else convince themselves it was permanent. That's how real power settles in. Even law enforcement, years later, would note how unusual it was. Harlem, surrounded by chaos, remained strangely consistent. No sudden shifts, no bloody takeovers, no drama. Tick collapses. Just balance. Balance achieved without treaties, without courts, without gunfire. People who truly understood the underworld knew why. Violence resets the board. Intelligence redraws it. Once redrawn, it doesn't need to be defended every day. The wedding became shorthand for that idea, a reminder that the most dangerous man isn't the loudest or the cruelest. It's the one who waits, gathers, and chooses the moment no one else can undo. That's why the story never really ends, because the lesson still works. As time went on, even the details of the wedding began to blur, but the outcome never did. People forgot the color of the ribbon, the exact words spoken, even the faces in the pews. What they remembered was the result. Harlem stayed untouched. That memory was enough to keep men cautious long after witnesses were gone. Younger players would sometimes laugh at the story, calling it exaggerated, impossible, something made larger by nostalgia. Those men rarely lasted. The ones who survived learned quickly that legends in that world were usually born from restraint, not exaggeration. Nobody invents a rule that costs them money unless the alternative once cost them everything. Bumpy Johnson understood something most never grasped. Power doesn't come from forcing others to obey. It comes from making disobedience feel irrational. After the wedding, challenging Harlem didn't feel brave. It felt foolish, and foolishness, more than fear, is what criminals avoid. Hours after Bumpy's death, the city changed. New drugs, new crimes, new money. Yet Harlem remained different. Not cleaner, not safer. Just governed by an invisible boundary everyone respected without needing to be reminded. That boundary was built in a church during a wedding with no violence at all. And that is why the story keeps going. Because every generation needs to relearn the same lesson. The man who wins isn't the one who strikes first. It's the one who chooses the moment no one can erase. Eventually, even the people telling the story began to change. The voices got younger, the accents shifted, but the pauses stayed in the same places, right before the doors opened, right before the box was handed over, right before the truth landed. Those pauses mattered. They were where the lesson lived. In back rooms and late-night conversations, the wedding stopped being about Bumpy Johnson as a man and became about Bumpy Johnson as an idea that intelligence could interrupt power, that information, if timed correctly, could freeze a room full of killers without a single weapon drawn. Some men tried to copy the move. None succeeded. They focused on the spectacle instead of the preparation. They wanted the moment without the months of work. Those attempts failed quickly, often violently. The difference was simple. Bumpy hadn't gambled, he had calculated. Harlem continued to change, like every neighborhood does. Businesses opened and closed, faces came and went. But the underlying rules stayed intact. No Italian family crossed north. No negotiations reopened the question. It wasn't fear that enforced it anymore. It was habit. Habit is the most durable form of power. Long after the last original witness was gone, Harlem's status remained unquestioned. People who had never met Bumpy Johnson still acted in accordance with a decision he forced decades earlier. That's when a story stops being history and starts becoming structure. The cathedral still stands. Weddings still happen there. Music still plays. But once, for a brief moment, truth walked down the aisle, and everything learned to move around it. And in the end, that's why the story never really finishes, because its effect is still playing out.